Okay, welcome to part 2 of editing contact forms in Shopify. In this part, I'm going to be showing you how to add completely new fields, like this website field, like this drop-down field, a new text area, or a checkbox like this. If you haven't watched part 1, you'll find that on my channel. It's called Editing Shopify Contact Forms Without an App. In that video, I just showed you a few basics, like how to change the labels here, the placeholders, the text for the button, and the text for the thank you message, and also how to remove a field, like the phone field that used to be here. And also what's quite important is that I showed you how to back up the code that we will be editing, because you want to be able to undo your changes in case you mess anything up. You'll find that there is a section of this video, a chapter that you can easily find called Backing Up the Code. And I recommend at least just doing that, just watching this part of the video and then coming back to this video. Guys, while editing this video, I just realized that it's going to be quite long, and that's because I go really in depth in teaching you the skills behind editing contact forms. I teach you HTML and CSS and the different kinds of form fields. So if you approach it from this perspective of an educational video, then I'm sure you will get a lot out of it. But if you're just looking for a quick answer to make a small edit to your theme, then I recommend just skipping to the chapter that relates to what you want to do. There will be different chapters for the text area, the drop down, the checkbox, and so on. The theme I'll be using for this tutorial is called Craft. It's the same code as the default Dawn theme, so if you're using Dawn, you'll be able to follow along very easily. Also, if you're using Color Block or actually any of the free Shopify 2.0 themes, then you will be able to follow along because they actually all have the same code. They're just different styling presets, but pretty much the same theme. If you have a different theme, that's also fine, because I'll be teaching you the actual concepts and skills that you need to edit contact forms on your own. I'll be explaining some of the basics of HTML and CSS, so you won't be lost, and I'm sure that you'll be able to take these skills and use them on any other theme. And in fact, I'll use this opportunity to quickly mention my upcoming course, which is called Shopify Coding for Store Owners. This course is all about teaching you the basics of HTML and CSS and Liquid so that you can be more independent and rely less on apps, rely less on developers, and just have more control over your own store. I'll be teaching these coding skills through very practical examples that you'll be able to use on your store immediately. So if you find this interesting, then definitely subscribe to my mailing list so that you will receive an email when I publish the course. Now, the first thing that we want to do is go to Online Store, Themes, and then open up the code for the theme that you're editing. So in my case, it's this theme, Craft, and I just want to click Edit Code. And if it's an unpublished theme, then you also want to preview this theme in a new tab. Okay, so I'm also previewing what I'm editing here. When you're in the code editor, you want to open up a file called contactform.liquid. This is on Craft, this is on Dawn, and on all the free Shopify 2.0 themes. We're only going to be working on this one file, so it's nice and easy. Now, if you're on an older theme, like for example, if you're on Debut, then this file is going to be called page.contact.liquid. And not just on Debut, but many of the older themes that are not on Shopify 2.0 are going to have this kind of naming. The code we're looking for, or the actual contact form, is all in between these tags here. See how it's like form and then contact inside this curly brace and then percentage sign? This is the actual contact form. Okay, this is where it begins. And this is where it ends with the end form tag. The same thing in Debut and in other themes, you will find a form contact like this. Here it's even simpler. So now let's just have a look at the code of the contact form. And if you're not familiar with the Chrome code inspector, just right click and click inspect anywhere on the page, and this should come up. Okay, I'm gonna enlarge it a little bit so you can see what's happening. But this is the Chrome Inspector, or otherwise known as Developer Tools or the console, many names. Okay, anyway, here we can see all the code of a web page, and use this little arrow icon, click on this, and now you can hover over things and see how they actually are built, right? You can see all the elements, and they're highlighted on the panel on the right as well. So when we hover over this and click on it, you will see that this name field is selected. Okay, so we know what that looks like now. And then we can hover over this and we know what this looks like. Okay, so this is an input and this is an input element. And both of these are in a div. They're in a div with the class or the name of field. So let's just close this up so that we can see the structure. It's like, okay, div field, and then these below, these are also div field. So all of our fields are in this div with the class or the name of field, and inside there's the actual input element. If you're not very familiar with HTML, that's fine. I'm going to explain things as we go along. So a div is like a container. It doesn't actually mean anything. So we have other elements like inputs, for example, or we have the form element, or we have the UL, for example, which is a list. A lot of these elements actually mean something. They're intended for a specific purpose. The H2 element is the heading, right? It's called a heading 2, whereas a div is just like a generic container. It's a box. It contains things, as you can see visually represented here. So why am I telling you this? Well, basically so that you can read the code and kind of understand what's going on. These are what we're looking for in our actual template file. Okay, so let's go back to that and let's look for those divs with the class of field. It's kind of all compressed here, so it's hard to read, but if you just look carefully, you can find these divs here. Div class field, there we go. Div class field. Okay, so let's try to just create some spacing around this, just so it's easier to read. Okay, and this doesn't change the code or anything. This is like just for us. You don't have to worry about spaces like this in code, in HTML at least. Okay, so we've separated some of these fields, and this looks like a container for these two fields. And do you know why that is? It's because these two are side by side, right? So they've got this extra container holding them, whereas this one is full width, so it doesn't have any extra container, and this one as well. So that's fine. Let's separate that out a little bit as well so it's readable, and let's separate that. That's the phone field. This is the text area, right? The text area is a multi-line text input. And these first two are obviously name and email. Let's just save that. That's not going to change anything on the storefront, but that's just going to make it easier for us to read. I'm going to take a minute now to introduce you to the concept of classes in HTML and CSS, because I don't want this to confuse you when we go further along. Classes in general are kind of descriptive. Like when we have a div, it doesn't mean anything, right? Unlike H2, for example. So when we have a div, we want to be descriptive in the class name. So this is a field. This is a contact fields, meaning that it wraps two of these, I assume. You know, this is contact button, which is self-explanatory. So they're descriptive, but they also have a purpose, and that purpose is to make these fields look a certain way, because the class is what connects your HTML to your CSS. Let me just show you a simplified example. What if I wanted to write a small sentence above my contact form saying that I'm on holiday and I'll get back to you soon. Goes my paragraph tag. This is just a paragraph, right? And let's say I want to make this bigger and red so it's noticeable. I could add styles like this inside the opening tag, and then I would do this color red and, you know, font size 25 pixels, something like that. Now, another way that I could do it is if I wanted to use this on another place on my site. I don't want to write these style changes every time. I'm going to cut them out of here. I'm going to remove this, and instead I'll write a class, and that class is going to be important text. Now I'm going to open up a new CSS file. I just created one here, and I'm going to write dot important text, and then I'm going to open these curly braces, and inside here I can paste my style rules. And what this is saying is that this is a class. Dot means class. These brackets contain the rules for the styles, and that's what links this CSS file to this HTML, the browser reads all of our files, Google Chrome, Firefox, whatever you're using, it reads all of the files that we have on our website. And it remembers that we have a class called important text and that it's red and the font size should be 25 pixels. And so when it comes across this paragraph with this class important text, it applies those rules. And this means that we can use this anywhere. For example, a list item, we have a list here, and this is a list item. We can also write class important text, and now this list item will be red and with 25 pixel font size. So going back to our actual fields, these classes called field are in our theme CSS. If you search for the word field, you will actually find various styling rules that apply to fields, right? So what this means is that if we remove this class, if we don't use this, then it's going to look totally different. If we don't use this field input, that's how it's going to look, right? If we don't use this field label, it's going to look like that. This is raw, unstyled default HTML. So when we work on an existing live website and we want things to look the same way as the rest of the site, we want our new content to look the same, then we should use the same classes. So on labels, we use field label, on inputs, we use field input, and on the container div, we use field. If your theme is different, these classes will be named differently. For example, on Debut, they just use these grid classes. The container is called grid item, and then inside they have the label and the input. The point is, you should continue to do whatever your theme is already doing. You want to use the same classes. All right, so let's get on with it. Let's actually create a new one-line text input. I'm going to copy and paste this name field because it's the same type of field, right? The name, it's like one line of text, and the field we want to create is also one line of text. Try to use tab and shift tab, or command and curly braces, or sorry, control and curly braces if you're on Windows, to actually make this aligned correctly so it's nice and neat. We want everything to be in one line just to create readable HTML. And the reason why I'm copy and pasting is because there's less chance for error and we don't have to rewrite everything, right? We don't want to manually type all this out because we're definitely going to make some kind of typo and it's going to break something. And it's the same field, so we just need to change a few small things. So let's go along, let's read this code and see what we need to change. Inside this div class of field, so we have this input, right? And the first thing we see is also a class, field input. And that's fine. Classes, they are usually used for styling, for the way it's going to look. We don't really want to change the class because we want it to look the same as the rest of our fields. So we leave that. Now this autocomplete. The autocomplete we do want to change, or we want to remove it completely. It tells Google what to suggest here. So see, when I click on name, it suggests my name. That's this in action, autocomplete name. Okay, so if you have a custom question, but if it's not like something typical, like name, then you probably won't need the autocomplete. So we've removed that. Next is type equals text. Okay, that tells the browser that this input is just a text input. So that's fine, we don't change that. Now ID is contact form dash name. Let's change that because in this theme we have, the ID is kind of what this thing is for. So ID contact form email, right? ID is contact form phone. I'm going to be asking people for their website because that's my example. On my own website, I ask people for their website address because they contact me with questions about their Shopify store. I'm just going to call this contact form website. So let's go further. Name equals contact, and then we have these square braces, and then inside the square braces we have these curly braces, and these curly braces are liquid code. Okay, Shopify liquid, which basically gets some data from the Shopify system. And we don't really need that here because what this is doing is actually connecting to the languages file. If you're not familiar with the languages file, you can go back and watch part 1, the part 1 video for this tutorial. But basically languages are just translations of all of these fields, all of these labels, or you can just change the wording. So instead of send, you can write submit or something like that. And that is done through the languages file, which you can access here in edit languages. And as you can see, I can change the wording of different phrases across the store. But we're not doing that today, and we're not going to be using the language file for our custom fields. We don't need that. So I'm going to remove all that liquid, and so we're left with contact and then these square braces. This is probably the most important part of this tutorial, because this is how you link fields to the actual Shopify system so that this information comes through in an email when somebody tries to contact you. So in here, I'm going to write website as well. And then the value. So this is when the page loads. If we want to pre-fill some kind of value in here, what this is saying is if this person is already a customer and they already have an account on your store, then it fills out the name, but we don't want that. And then the placeholder. So in HTML, placeholder text is this text that actually appears on top of a form field. It's not the actual text, right? Like the actual text is this, and this is the placeholder. The placeholder also is linked to the languages file for the name field, and we don't want that. So in the placeholder, we're gonna write whatever we want people to actually see. You know, here I was using a lowercase everywhere because it's for the browser or for Shopify, but here I'm going to actually write, you know, in proper sentence case. So that's all for the input field. That should work now. The next part is the label. What is a label? A label is usually something that goes on top of the input field. You might have seen on other websites where name would not be here, it would be like slightly above. So that's a label. In Dawn and in Craft and all of these Shopify 2.0 themes, they use the label and placeholder interchangeably, like they're both in this location, right? So that's why we can't see the label, but the label is still important for the browser, and especially for blind people, for example, for screen readers, for accessibility purposes, for like people using different kinds of technology to access your website. So the label should just say, you know, the same thing. So it should say what that field is about. And every label has this for attribute, and the for has to match the ID of the input. So we just copy that and just paste that here. And now those two things are linked, the label and the input, and that field is done. Let's save and let's refresh. Now we have the name field, and right next to it, we have the website field. And now the last thing that you might want to do is move this website field onto its own separate line, just like the phone number field. And to do that, we just need to move it out of this contact fields div, which, as we can see when we hover over it, makes two columns, right? So everything inside this div is going to be split into a 50% column. We can actually just experiment with this in the browser by grabbing this website field and just dragging it out here and seeing what that does. And as you can see, it put it on its own line. So we're just going to do the same thing in the code. Let's copy our field and then find the closing div of the contact fields div, and right after that just paste that in. Make sure that it's in line with the div below it. Okay, so everything's nice and neat. We can delete it from here. Hit save. And now when we refresh, we see this website field in its full width. And likewise, if you're using another theme like Debut or like any other older theme, then you might have different HTML. So for example, it might be div class grid as the parent container of these two fields, the name and the email field, which are both 50%. You have the parent, which is div class grid, and grid half gutters that just says what the spacing should be between the columns. And then inside there are these two divs of class grid item and medium up 1/2. And what this class does is it just makes it a half width column on medium devices and up. So meaning on desktop, but not on mobiles. On mobiles, these will be full width. And then inside of these divs, obviously we have our label and input. I hope everything is making sense so far. I was going a bit slow because I was just introducing the basics of editing these attributes, classes, divs, right? But now I'm going to speed it up a bit, and I'm going to show you how to do a drop down, a larger text area, and a checkbox. So next we have the text area. Okay, the text area is what the multi-line text input is called in HTML. For these one-line inputs, you use the element that is called input, And for these multi-line inputs, use an element called textarea. So we're going to find the field that contains the text area, and we're going to copy the entire thing. Okay, copy that and paste it below. Fix up the formatting a little bit like that. And once again, we need a name for it. I'm going to call it message field. So just the word message. Firstly, in the ID, just following this kind of standard that they've set, they've got all their fields as contact form dash something, right? Contact form dash website. This is contact form dash body. Body is in meaning the body text. In our case, contact form message like that. This, the contact, and then the square brackets. As I told you before, these square brackets are what actually links it to the email that you're going to receive after somebody uses the contact form. So this is the most important part. I'm going to put message in here, and then in the placeholder as well, I'm going to put the word message with a capital this time. Inside the text area, we have some pre-fill, but in our case, we won't have pre-fill text, so you can just remove that. And it's just going to be like, this is the opening text area tag with attributes, and then the closing text area tag. Then the label, we don't need to change anything really with the label except for the for to link it to the ID of this text area, right? So exactly the same like that. And then instead of the translation file, we're going to write our own text. That's all. We can save that. And now we can refresh, and okay, it looks a bit weird, and I would say it's because we have this space, right? So instead of this text area being on the next line here, we just need to have no space inside, no enter inside of this text area tag. Okay, so let's save that, refresh, and it looks normal now. And now I'm just going to test the form because I realized that I haven't tested it actually after I did the website field. I haven't demonstrated this to you, that it actually works. So I'm going to submit this form and I'll show you what it looks like in my email. So I filled out this form, everything except the phone number, and I'm going to send and have this thank you message. In part 1 of this series, the first video, I showed you how to change that thank you message. So if you want to change that, watch that video. And here is the message that I received. So it has this automatic section called country code. Shopify does that by itself. It's not a field that you can see, but we have the new website field and we have the new message field, and it's exactly how we named it. Now let's get started building our drop-down field, which looks like this. Lets you choose from any number of options, and it has a default choose an option field, which you cannot select, it's disabled. This is probably the hardest field to build because we can't copy paste. Like the contact form does not have a drop-down field, but you will be able to copy and paste the code. If you go to ed.codes to my site and go to tutorials, you will find the latest tutorial will be about editing contact forms, and you'll find all of the code that we wrote today. But if you want to follow along and understand what's going on here, then keep watching. A drop-down element is called a select officially in HTML, and it's written like this, select. And then inside this select, like this, we have options. So we would write option like this, and inside these options we have each option. So you can save this and we'll see what it looks like, and it won't look very good at all. That's what it looks like. That is a default unstyled HTML select element. So we need to add classes and divs and make the structure the same as the rest of our theme so that it looks a lot nicer like this, right? And in this case, it would be very nice to have an example, wouldn't it? If we had somewhere on our theme a drop-down element like this, and actually we do. If you log in to your customer account, so by going to customers or /account/login on any Shopify store, you are able to have a look at the address form, right? So go into account and then click view addresses and then add a new address. And there's an address form with this country region dropdown. And so we can see how that's styled by inspecting the code, and we can see what kind of class they have on this div. They have this container div called div select. Inside that, they have the actual select element, and they have the options, right? And then they have this SVG, which is the little caret. So let's make that same structure. First, we're going to wrap everything in a div with the class of select. And we're also going to put all of this into a div with the class of field, because all of our fields are in this div with the class of field, and indent everything inside. Let's save that and see what it looks like. It should at least have a border now, right? Yes, it does. And let's now add classes to our actual select element. So I'm looking at this, the code that I already wrote. I know the classes, but actually I took these from, well, firstly, the field input is the class that all of our fields have. So I'm going to use that. And then I also had a look at base.css, and I simply searched for the word select, and maybe with an underscore, because there is this double underscore format, and I found that there is a class called select like this, which is intended for select elements. So I also added that class, and both of those in combination looked a lot nicer. Okay, so we're getting there. One thing that I should have mentioned to you is that inside of these options we do need a value, because that's actually the value that will be sent to Shopify system. This value here is just what people see. So you would write something like this, value red, and then you also could have an option that is a default option, and we can add some attributes to it which make it disabled. So if we just add the word disabled here, it used to be written like this, like any other attribute in HTML, disabled equals disabled, right? But that's kind of stupid. So in modern HTML, we can just write disabled. We can also write required and things like that. And we can also write selected, which makes this the default. So if it's both selected and disabled, that means that it'll show at first, but then people won't be able to click it again. Lastly, the other thing that we need to add inside of this field div is the label, because every field should have a label. And remember, it's just in Dawn theme that the label and the placeholder is like showing up in the same place like this. Usually labels would show above the form input. So you may be using a theme that does that. I'm going to add the class of field __ label, because all of our labels are using field label. And we're going to connect this label to our select by using the for and the ID on the select. So our ID on our select should be going with the convention of all our others, contact form -phone. I'll call this contact form -color. And then here we're going to write for and the exact same. Now those two are linked. That looks a bit better, but it's weird because we're showing the label and the first option at the same time. We only want to be showing one of those, and the label is here because in this theme, all the labels are moved on top of the field. So in our case, I realized that the best thing to do is actually to hide the label and to make the text for the first option a bit larger so that it looks like the labels on the rest of the fields. So let's do that. Firstly, we're just going to do style equals visibility hidden on this label. And we don't want to use the more common display none, because we still want screen readers and bots to be able to see that this label is here. Display none hides it from screen readers as well, whereas visibility hidden just makes it invisible. So when we save, we should see that we no longer see the label, and now we should just make the font size bigger on the actual select. So to do that, we're just going to add a style tag here. So to do that, we're just going to add a style attribute here, and we're going to use font size inherit. What inherit does is it takes the font size from the parent or the parent container, which in our case is probably the form or fields, but basically it's going to be the same as these other options. And then we just want to change the padding top as well because it was way too low. So now that looks a bit better. The last thing we want to do is to add this caret so that it actually looks like a dropdown, because if you leave it like this, it's not really clear what this is. In this theme, the caret is an SVG, meaning that it's not included as an image, it's included as an SVG, which is like an image in code, right? So you will need to copy and paste this. If you're using Dawn, if you're using a different type of theme, then you have to look at your addresses page, like I mentioned before, and see how the caret is done and see how the styling is done here in general. and maybe apply the same classes. But in Dawn, in Craft, in all of those free Shopify 2.0 themes, it's using an SVG like this. You just need to put this SVG text, this SVG, anywhere on the page. Literally just, well, mine's already on the page here, so I don't need to include it a second time, but you will place this anywhere on the page and it's display none, okay? It's hidden, and that's because we are referencing this SVG. We put it anywhere on the page, mine is here, and then we reference it lower down. So under this select, as you can see, we have this. So SVG class is icon caret, and this is what actually shows it, and it uses the tag use, and this links it to this. So this ID href icon caret and this ID icon caret are the same. So let's add this under this select, and there we go. We are almost finished with this select, but we forgot one crucial thing, and that is actually linking this select element to Shopify using the name attribute with that square bracket notation that we saw in all of our fields, contact and then square brackets and then give it the name. On the select element, we're going to add that attribute. You can add it anywhere. Let's add it here. Name equals contact, because contact form, right? Square brackets, and then we're going to call it color. That's it. That will now be connected to the Shopify system. You will now receive contact form emails with the color field working. And so that is the select field done. Next, we'll move on to doing the checkbox, which luckily is a lot easier. The checkbox is very useful in many contact forms. I've got I agree, just an example, because many sites have something like that. I agree to the terms and conditions, whatever. You might also be asking people if this is a certain type of product, if this is a gift, for example. So you might just want a simple checkbox, and luckily it's very easy to build as well. This is the entire code for it. I'm just going to walk you through it pretty quickly. We have an input. The input tag in HTML does not have a closing tag. The input is type of checkbox, and the name, as with all our contact fields, has contact and then these square brackets, and then inside the square brackets you're going to put whatever you want to call this checkbox, whatever you want to see in the email that you receive, and then the value. If this is like a gift, then you can write yes. Then we have a label, of course, because all fields should have a label. And then inside this label, all we need is a for, because there's nothing too fancy, there's nothing to really style here. And we're gonna write whatever text we want to appear next to the checkbox. All right, so this I agree, whatever text we want to appear there. Let's save that for now, see how that looks. So that already looks okay. You might notice that it's a bit like lower than this checkbox. I made mine a little bit on the same line. And you might also notice that if you wanted to add this somewhere here, let's just drag these up and see what they look like when they're above something. You see there's no margin. There's no margin bottom. I just want to add some margin bottom, and I want to align this text a little bit better to the actual checkbox. So that's why I've wrapped it in this div here. So you're just going to put a div around. So you're just going to put a div around these so that they're contained together. And then we're just going to put a margin, quite simply, just using the style tag. We're going to write to_rem. We're going to use to_rem because this is the unit that this theme is already using. We can see that all of our fields here, they have a margin bottom of to_rem. Okay, and this is different from pixels. Basically, rems are just like a baseline size that your website is already using. I don't want to go too into it right now. The point is that all of our field classes are using rems, margin bottom to_rem, and so we're going to write exactly the same thing, margin bottom to_rem. And then the next thing we just want to do is display flex, align items center. And using these two in combination is just a really easy and quick way to make sure things align on the horizontal axis, right? So that the text or the checkbox are not higher than the other one. So I'm going to hit save, and we're going to take a look at that, and that's all. That's all there is to the checkbox. We can now put this somewhere above our final message. Like, what if this was a gift message, for example, right? If this is a gift message, then we want the checkbox "this is a gift" above that. Let's hit save. Take a look, this is a gift, and then message. That's all I'm going to show you today for this tutorial. I think that really this tutorial has become so long, much longer than I expected, so that's probably enough. The last thing I want to show you is where to actually find more information if you want to do a different type of form field. So one thing I did not cover is radio buttons. That's like a checkbox, but only lets you choose one thing out of, say, a list. The other thing is different types of inputs. So there's the phone number input, there's website input, there's email inputs, there's different types of inputs. And the first place that I would recommend you take a look is the MDN web docs by Mozilla. So these are always a good place to reference. You can just look up MDN form elements like this, except spell it correctly. And you will find various resources about the types of inputs that there are, as well as the different kinds of form elements. So here we see a select, and this gives you an example of what a select looks like. So that's where you would usually look for a variety of different technologies. For Shopify specifically though, there is a page on shopify.dev called Add a Contact Form to Your Theme. I will of course add the link to this page in the description as well. But this has some examples of contact form fields. So for example, the drop-down type, that's the select element, which I already showed you. Then there's the radio type, which I did not show you because it was kind of easier than the select element and it's kind of similar. So a radio button is just lots of different inputs next to each other. So it's almost like the one-line input that I showed you in the beginning, except it's going to be input type radio. Right, and of course the checkbox, which is just the input type of checkbox, and a label. Of course, these are all generic. They're not for a specific theme. They're not for Dawn. They're not going to be for your theme either if you have a purchased theme. So you're going to have to change all of these to fit in with the style of your theme, which is why I went so in depth in that in my tutorial, because I want you to be able to look at your theme and understand what you need to do to these things, what classes you need to add, or how you should change the structure so that it is the same as your theme. That's the most important thing. If you've just watched to the end of this tutorial, that's amazing. I hope you found it useful. I hope you picked up some new skills. I'm just going to mention my course one more time. You should subscribe to my mailing list if you want to find out about more courses that I'm doing. I'll be doing a Shopify coding course. I'll be talking about HTML, CSS, and Liquid. And it's going to be a very practical and to the point type of course. I'm not going to be covering a lot of theory. I'm going to be doing things that are practical examples like what I showed you today, teaching you HTML and CSS, but by actually doing something on your website, not on some kind of example project. So visit ed.codes, scroll down on the homepage and subscribe to my mailing list here. You can also, of course, contact me. Let me know what you would like to learn about. Let me know any questions you might have, any comments. Of course, like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. And I'll see you next time. Good luck.